This next segment is very important. It's called Why an Income Tax is Not Necessary to Fund the U.S. Government. Can this statement possibly be true? In order to answer this question, Americans must first understand what the source of the money that funds the government is and where it goes. Contrary to the sound bites issued by the two mainstream political parties, the reality of how the system actually works will not only open your eyes, but hopefully stimulate the American people to demand that the thievery underway comes to an end. Understanding the income tax hoax. This informational tool is not for the purpose of educating Americans on the voluntary federal income tax. We encourage each and every individual to investigate this insidious second plank of the Communist Manifesto so that they might understand the grievous wrong done by Congress to the people over the past 88 years. Where do your income tax dollars go? The best place to look for an answer to this question would be a government report. So let's just take one at random. This report is titled President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control, a report to President Ronald Reagan, dated January 15, 1984. It is available from the Congressional Research Service. The excerpt below is found on page 12. This document is also found in the reading room on my website, www.devvy.com. Page 12. Point 1. Importantly, any meaningful increase in taxes from personal income would have to come from lower and middle income families, as 90% of all personal taxable income is generated below the taxable income level of $35,000. Point 2. Further, there isn't much more that can be extracted from high income brackets. If the government took 100% of all taxable income beyond the $75,000 tax bracket not already taxed, it would only get $17 billion, and this confiscation, which would destroy productive enterprise, would be only sufficient to run the government for several days. Point 3 of this report to President Reagan. Resistance to additional income taxes would be even more widespread if people were aware that, with 2/3 of everyone's personal income taxes wasted or not collected, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal government contributions to payments, transfer payments, and the national debt. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services which taxpayers expect from their government. End of quote from page 12. How can that be? In order to answer this question, an individual must learn how the privately owned Federal Reserve or central bank actually works. In a nutshell, this is how the scam works, and I'm going to give you an excerpt from Debt Virus by a brilliant man named Dr. Jacques Jacaran on page 216 of his book. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 requires the central bank to return a small portion of its unconstitutional gains to the U.S. Treasury. Here's an example of the numbers. In 1988, the Federal Reserve has an income of $19.5 billion, and it turned back $17.36 billion to the U.S. Treasury as provided under its charter. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 provided that a substantial portion of the Fed's annual profits be turned over to the National Treasury. Does this fact dilute the argument that there are vast profits built into the commercial banking system? No. Consider for a moment that the total public debt versus private debt at the end of 1988 was in excess of $11 trillion. And of course, today, and I wrote this paper 3 years ago, today the debt is in excess of $44 trillion. The discount rate at which banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve banks at that time was 9.4%. Assuming the debt carried the same rate as the discount rate, there was an annual interest charge of almost $1 trillion on the total debt owed to the banking system. While all of this interest payment does not go to commercial banks, an overwhelmingly large part of it does. And that's the end of the excerpt. Our founding fathers, the ones our elected public servants are always chirping they respect, warned the American people about usury and unscrupulous bankers. Quote, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power of money should be taken from banks and restored to Congress and the people to whom it belongs. I sincerely believe the banking institutions having the issuing power of money are more dangerous to liberty than standing armies." Unquote, Thomas Jefferson. So what we have here is a central bank issuing worthless paper money that controls our economy, our lives, and our future. This private banking cartel was unconstitutionally granted this power by a devious, scheming group of senators back in 1913. In essence, what they did was place the American people into indentured servitude by forcing the people to pay usury on worthless fiat currency, which means paper money created out of nothing, not to fund the government, but to enrich the bankers and fund wars in which America should never be allowed. This system exists not to fund the government, but to allow the U.S. Congress carte blanche power to continue funding unconstitutional agencies and programs by providing them with a bottomless source of worthless ink. The national debt and the deficit. These two little bookkeeping items are not the same thing. Few Americans actually know the difference, but the difference is quite important. We continually hear members of Congress, president after president, and political pundits call for reduction in the debt. But what does that really mean? Here's how it works in the most simplified way to fit into this document. Let's say that for 2002, Congress and the President decide they want $1.7 trillion to fund this bloated pig called our government. We know that 100% of all personal income taxes extorted by the IRS goes to the privately owned Federal Reserve banking system and does not fund a single function of the government. So let's take the people's blood and sweat off the table. What other revenues does the government collect? Corporate taxes, Social Security taxes, constitutional revenues such as excise taxes on cigarettes, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, tires, etc., tariffs on trade, military hardware sales, and some other minor categories. Let's say that those revenues will total $900 billion. The politicians want $1.7 trillion to spend on their favorite welfare programs, wars and foreign welfare, but have a shortfall of $800 billion. This is called the deficit, and the deficit created by the spending of Congress creates the national debt. How? Because the politicians are $800 billion short, they simply call up Alan Greenspan and borrow your children and grandbabies' futures. The privately owned Federal Reserve banks don't loan anything of value to Congress. They aren't banks. They're really an overpaid, powerful cabal operating as a private accounting service. When that $800 billion worth of ink is transferred to the Treasury, it gets piled on top of the existing national debt. How? Because the politicians are $800 billion short, they simply call up Alan Greenspan and borrow your children and grandbabies' futures. The privately owned Federal Reserve banks don't loan anything of value to Congress. They aren't banks. They're really an overpaid, powerful private accounting service. When that $800 billion worth of ink is transferred to the Treasury, it gets piled on top of the existing national debt. This is how the magical money machine works. Congress overspends. It borrows from this accounting firm called the Fed, and then turns around and tells you to pay for these crimes against the people. In other words, Congress basically pays the bills with Social Security taxes and borrowed ink from the private Fed. Pretty slick scam, wouldn't you say? The people of America are also responsible to a large degree for this out-of-control spending. Americans have been bred to a welfare-dependent mentality. Special interest groups who have no interest in the U.S. Constitution demand that billions of dollars be spent on their pet interests. Billions upon billions of dollars have been unconstitutionally thrown to foreign governments, some days our friend, a week later our enemy. They are only our friend as long as the U.S. throws money at their corrupt governments. Billions of dollars have unconstitutionally been spent on grants to colleges and universities, which in turn sell their research to the highest bidder, paid for by the sweat off the back of the little guy out in America. No, they don't return any back to the little guy who funded these studies and research programs. They keep all the money. As long as the American people themselves condone continued unconstitutional spending by Congress, the longer they will violate their oath of office and continue to fund unconstitutional expenditures, placing your children and grandbabies in a state of unpayable massive debt. Unless the people themselves demand an end to this insanity, our economy eventually will collapse under the weight of this massive unpayable debt, no matter how much ink the privately owned Fed transfers into the coffers of the U.S. Treasury. The pain of withdrawal from unlawful government handouts will be far less now than it will be down the road. And don't forget this. The Federal Reserve issues stock to Class A stockholders, but you know what? Neither you nor I can own any stock in this private banking cabal. Only the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and other international families own up all the stock. And if you think that they aren't privately owned, the federal courts have ruled that the Federal Reserve banking system indeed is a collection of privately held banks. They only cleverly and deceptively use the word federal to make people think that this private banking cartel is part of our government when they aren't. America became the greatest debt-free nation on earth by a resourceful, independent, self-reliant people. Sadly, today we have a large percentage of our population who can't get through the day without a government memo telling them how, step by step, with the redistribution of average, ordinary Americans' assets into the hands of the unproductive. A very sad commentary to what made our nation great and prosperous. But I heard the debt is being paid down. What you heard and reality are two separate issues altogether. The politicians must continue to fool the American people, lest they catch on to this chicanery. Let's have a look at the numbers so that you can see that any utterance that the national debt has been paid down X billions of dollars is nothing more than bombastic gas passed from one administration to the next and the latest recycled Congress. In the chart below, an R next to the amount indicates a Republican president. A D is for a Democrat in the Oval Office. The Democrats had control of Congress from 1954 until the illusion billed as the Republican Revolution in 1994. Both houses of Congress were Republican-controlled until after the 2000 election, but this ended when in May 2001, James Jeffords fessed up to his real political agenda. Now, for the sake of these CDs and one for the road, it's difficult to give you the exact numbers to the penny. However, I will try to do my best here. As of August 2001, the congressionally created national debt was $5.7 trillion with a Republican in the White House. And it continues to escalate. Right now, with the Republican in the White House, it is $7.9 trillion. But if you go back to 2003, it was let me go back to a Democratic president. September 30th, 1996, it was $5.2 trillion under a Democrat. So it doesn't really matter. And again, if you can see the numbers, these statistics were obtained from the Bureau of the Public Debt's website. As you can see, it doesn't matter which party is in office. There is no surplus, and the debt cannot be paid down. It can only grow exponentially as long as Congress and the president have the central bank at their fingertips. A balanced budget is nothing more than good political rhetoric, But in reality, it's a pipe dream strictly for public consumption. How can you balance your budget if you have no money to spend and are trillions of dollars in the hole? You can't. It's just another well-crafted illusion to keep the masses pacified. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but the American people have awakened to this monumental theft and are demanding the only real solution that can be implemented. Abolish the central bank and return to a constitutional monetary system with no income tax. We had no income tax before 1913 because we had no central bank. 1913 was a bad year for America. We had the fraudulent ratification of the 16th Amendment, the so-called Income Tax Amendment. It was not ratified. Mr. Bill Benson went to all 48 states' legislatures at the time that the vote was taken. He has 17,000 court-certified documents that prove that the 16th Amendment, or the so-called Income Tax Amendment, was never ratified. He did the 17th Amendment at the same time. It was not ratified. And in December of 1913, the international bankers got their way, and these duplicitous, deceitful senators got the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 through. It was signed into law, and America has gone down the road of debt ever since. No Fed, no need for a direct tax. Without the central bank siphoning off the wealth of our nation, there would be no need for a personal income tax. Don't be fooled by this chant around the country for a flat tax, a consumption tax, sales tax, or any other kind of personal income tax. There is absolutely no authority in the U.S. Constitution to implement any of these forms of taxation without apportionment. It is for this reason and this reason alone that when it became apparent that the 16th Amendment was not going to be ratified by the states, fraud was committed and it was simply proclaimed ratified by then Secretary of State Philander Chase Knox. We don't need any direct taxation, and these popular mantras are just new lies to replace old lies. Any one of these forms of taxation will still feed the cancer, the central bank. Any one of these forms of taxation is just another way to fleece the American people to enrich the pockets of the international banking cartel. Please consider the words of Congressman Ron Paul. Quote, "Strictly speaking, it probably is not necessary for the federal government to tax anyone directly. It could simply print the money it needs. However, that would be too bold a stroke, for it would then be obvious to all what kind of counterfeiting operation the government is running. The present system combining taxation and inflation is akin to watering the milk. Too much water and the people catch on," unquote. What we need to do is take away the magical money machine called the Fed, which Andrew Jackson did. It was a major battle back then, but this man had courage that no politician in Washington has today. We need to get rid of the privately owned Federal Reserve, which will force Congress to live within its means and fund only those activities specifically enumerated by the supreme law of the land in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which you can read in any encyclopedia, law library, and I'm not going to take the time to read all of that on the CD right now. There is absolutely no authority for the federal government to legislate in areas of the environment, education, the NEA, the FDA, and many others. It may surprise you to find out that agencies such as the FDA, DEA, and the EPA all derive their jurisdiction from international treaties. When the powers that be wish to circumvent the U.S. Constitution and stomp on your rights, they do it either through an executive order or international treaties. I strongly encourage you to investigate this issue thoroughly. Prior to the Federal Department of Education, America had the finest schools in the world. Since this disastrous and unconstitutional grab for power, we can all see that $250 billion a year will not fix our schools, and they continue to decline faster than the feds or states can shovel money into them. Even if a direct tax were necessary, only by keeping it at its lowest possible percentage would it ever benefit this nation. Quote, the point now emphasized is that the evil effects of high surtaxes fall not upon the individual whose income is seized and taken, but ultimately almost entirely upon the mass of the people who are thereby deprived of the benefits which would result from the free flow of commercial transactions and the use of the additional capital which would be available for productive enterprise. The revenues to be obtained by the government from this class of taxes depends upon transactions in trade and commerce which bring about income available for payment of taxes. It is highly desirable, in the interest of the production of revenue, that the volume of business transactions giving rise to gain shall be as great as possible, and to this end it is essential that the natural laws of trade and commerce and the free flow of business shall not be interfered with or prevented. But the direct effect of these very high taxes is to hinder and prevent business transactions which would otherwise take place. A man may have property which he has held for years and which has greatly increased in value, and he would like to sell it. But if he does, a large part of the gain would have to be paid out in taxes. He would rather keep the property than sell it, pay the tax, and invest what is left in something else. At the same time, the party desiring to buy this property, if he obtained it, would improve it with buildings. What is the result? The transaction does not take place and the community loses the advantage which would come in the stimulation that would arise from the transactions resulting from the buyer's improvement of the property, and it also loses the advantage of the seller's putting his money into some other form of investment, which in turn would give rise to business transactions. The same thing on a much greater scale is true in manufacturing and mercantile lines. Men have built up enterprises to the point where they're highly successful. They would like to take their profit and turn the business over to younger men to carry on. These transactions are highly desirable not only for the parties, but for the community. Yet they are absolutely stopped because, if made, the seller would have to pay in 1 year a tax on a gain, which has been the result of perhaps the better part of a lifetime of effort. And in all such cases, the government gets no tax, whereas if the rates were reasonable, the transactions would take place and the government's revenues would benefit accordingly. The free interchange of property and business transactions is essential to the normal prosperity of the country, and each such transaction has a direct tendency to bring about others of like character, with the result of increasing the amount of gain or income available for transaction. But when the tax is so high as to act as a deterrent against usual and desirable business transactions, and the volume of such transactions is thereby lessened, the inevitable result is for the tax to become less and less productive. It is for these reasons that, particularly in the higher brackets, a lower tax rate will produce more revenue in the long run than excessive rates. So long as a high rate stands in the way of accomplishing bargains and sales, the government receives no tax. But at a lower rate, the transactions proceed and the government shares in the profits. End of this excerpt. Today, Americans are being fleeced to the tune of approximately 52% of every dollar going for local, state, and federal taxes. The day is rapidly approaching when making even $1,000 an hour will not be enough to survive. How much longer are the people of this nation going to put up with this state of affairs? We say enough is enough. Our founding fathers, who believed in private property ownership and didn't believe the little man should be taxed to death, are probably spinning in their graves at what's been taking place against we the people. A pioneer on the withholding issue. Vivian Kellums was a woman before her time who knew the grand theft taking place against the working man's paycheck. And for more information on this incredible woman, I also have a website that I keep in memory of Vivian Kellums. It is www.viviankellums.com. The following excerpt is from pages 41 through 46 of her book, Toil, Taxes, and Trouble, published in 1952, and she is right on point. Quote, since a capitation means a tax of the same amount for every person, This provision makes doubly sure that all federal taxes must be at the same uniform rate for everybody. This limitation that direct taxes be levied by the federal government must be in proportion to a census and apportioned among the states in accordance with numbers, is the only provision in the Constitution that is stated twice. The only reason that our Constitution required a census to be taken every 10 years was to count the people to determine how many representatives should go to Congress and how direct taxes should be levied. I wonder how many Americans thought of this in 1950 when those little busybodies came knocking on their doors asking 10,000 impudent, silly questions which were none of their or Washington's business. There is absolutely no power granted in the Constitution which enables a top-heavy bureaucracy of empty-headed simpletons and worse to invade the privacy of the American people in such a monstrous manner. This census is just a preview of what is really in store for us if they actually take over, which they most certainly will do unless we uproot and vote them out. The census was to count the people, and that was all. The number of people determined the number of representatives in Congress and the apportionment of direct taxes among the states. For a long time, I asked myself, why were representatives and direct taxes linked together and apportioned among the states in accordance with population? It was understandable that representatives should be chosen in accordance with numbers, but why should taxes be apportioned the same way? And then one day, out of the blue, it came to me crystal clear. All at once, I understood the plan to safeguard the future freedom of the nation, conceived and executed by those scholarly men. I read again, representatives and direct taxes shall be included within this union according to their respective numbers. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census of enumeration hereinbefore directed to be taken. And in those two sentences, our forefathers bound fast the hands of Congress and secured the liberty and freedom of the American people. How? By making it utterly impossible to levy an income tax. An income tax is certainly a direct tax, probably the most direct tax of all, since it cannot be shifted but must be paid by the person receiving the income. By specifying that direct taxes must be levied in accordance with the number of people, not upon what they produced, as in the days of ancient Egypt, an income tax was simply out of the question. It cannot be levied upon a man, but must be levied upon what he receives. Our forefathers designed and incorporated in the Constitution a new system of government. It was built upon a revolutionary idea, the conviction that the government belonged to the people and existed only by their consent. Its genius lay in the careful system of checks and balances, along with the three departments, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And it went further and maintained a balance between the powers of the individual states and the federal government. In addition, it carefully reserved to the states and to the people all rights and powers not specifically delegated or prohibited to the federal government, and further stated that because certain rights were enumerated in the Constitution, it did not mean that others not mentioned were still not the property of the people. However, everything in the Constitution was arrived at by compromise. The interests and concerns of the 13 states varied widely, and each delegate was sent to Philadelphia to protect the commerce, industry, and agriculture of his particular state. It required months of patient discussion, argument, and forbearance to finally produce the finished document, which, when completed, comprised a system of government to protect the people in the rights and liberties set down in flaming words in the Declaration of Independence. It is a wonderful document, the best system of government ever devised for human beings, but it could only have varied in some respects and still have worked satisfactory. The supreme achievement of the combined brains of all those men were written into those two sentences, and the freedom and liberty of the American people were secured in them. For in those two sentences, the right of the free man to own something was made inviolate. This was his distinguishing mark, the only criterion of freedom in all the world, the right of the common man to retain for himself the fruit of his labor. Now, this is how it worked. Every man was given a vote with which he could vote for his representative. Originally, only representatives were elected, senators were appointed by the state legislatures, and it's too bad we changed that provision. And just a little editor's note here, we did not. Like the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment is a fraud. It was never ratified by the states. Going back to Vivian Kellum's text. That representative, having to stand for election every 2 years, was close to the people and responsive to their wishes. That is why he was given the power to tax. All bills of revenue arise in the House. And that is why he must come home every 2 years and give an accounting to the people. But his power to levy direct taxes was limited by an iron-bound restriction. That tax must be apportioned among the states in accordance with the population. Since all taxes were to be a uniform rate, Congress simply could not penalize one section of the country or one group of citizens for the unfair advantage of another. When Congress levied a tax, everybody had to pay, and at the same rate. The amount would vary with the wealth of an area, as it does today with the different values of real estate, but the rate was the same for all, and the tax was distributed among the states according to the population. The men who wrote our Constitution did not found a democracy. They feared the so-called Democrats of their day as much as we fear the communists today. They did not believe in mob rule or government by the unintelligent, irresponsible mass. They founded a constitutional republic, and they made certain that the right to vote should be curbed and controlled by the necessity of paying taxes. Scheming politicians could not take taxes from a helpless minority and buy themselves back into office with the votes of the tax-exempt majority. When a representative voted a tax, he voted to tax everybody because the tax was based on numbers, not upon dollars. This was the most brilliant plan ever conceived for guaranteeing the freedom of a nation. It protected every person in his right to private property, rich and poor alike, and under this protection we built the richest, most powerful nation on earth. We achieved and maintained for the majority of our people a standard of living undreamed of before, the hope and the envy of the free world. And we accomplished something even more important. We developed a vigorous, self-reliant, self-respecting race of people. An American citizen would have been ashamed to ask for a handout from his government. The government belonged to him. He did not belong to the government. And then what happened? We chucked our carefully safeguarded right to own something right out the window, and we passed the income tax amendment. Gone was our apportionment among the states in accordance with population, and also gone was our principle of uniformity. Income from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration, could be taxed and without limit. And when we passed this income tax amendment, which of course I mentioned it was never passed, the slow distilled poison of tax slavery dripped into our veins. We sowed the seeds of our national decay, which is rapidly coming to maturity before our eyes today. The heritage of freedom so carefully ensured for us by our forefathers is gone. It has been taxed away. And as I mentioned, this was from Vivian Kellum's book she wrote in 1952. She wrote this book after she sued the federal government on the withholding issue. I took a trip from Sacramento, California, all the way to the National Archives in Boston to retain all of her trial files, and they are available on my CD. Vivian Kellums was truly a remarkable woman for her time. Now I want to go into the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. The majority of unconstitutional spending is justified by the, quote, General Welfare Clause of the Constitution. Sean O'Connor of the Free Enterprise Society summed up this misconception in one of his speeches paraphrased below. Quote, discussion of the General Welfare Clause of the Constitution by the courts relies upon the Federalist Papers. This term simply means taxation was to protect the individual's life, liberty, and ownership of private property. One can go to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 of the Constitution and read the General Welfare Clause. Then one can do some history research and see what the Anti-Federalists had to say about this clause. That this clause conveys absolute power to the central government. Patrick Henry was very vocal in his opposition to putting this kind of language into the Constitution. Madison, however, assured Patrick Henry and others that all the General Welfare Clause represented was a preliminary introduction prior to the enumerating the specific powers the delegates were about to grant to this new federal government, and that the General Welfare Clause granted no new power to the government whatsoever. It was simply an introductory statement. The Anti-Federalists still weren't satisfied. Hamilton and Madison came back to restate that if the General Welfare Clause conveyed absolute power to the government, why would they go on to list the specific powers they were going to grant the government? That wouldn't make any sense at all if they were going to give absolute power to this government. It was finally conceded by all at the convention that the General Welfare Clause conveyed absolutely no new power to the government. End of comment. The General Welfare Clause of the Constitution has been misused for personal gain by special interest groups to enrich the pockets of the banking cartel, by politicians hoping to get that vote, and an all-out push to turn America into a socialist country, beginning with the New Deal implemented by FDR and supported by a weak Congress. Lyndon Johnson took the quest to turn America into a socialist nation to new and grotesque heights. How would you fund the federal government without any direct taxation? The powers that be know it's just a matter of time before the truth reaches enough Americans about the voluntary income tax system. Already trial balloons are being floated to once again fool the people into some sort of alternative tax in order to feed the central bank. America functioned very well without an income tax throughout the history of this republic. The answer to the question of funding without a direct tax is found in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution since 1787. It provides for Congress to pass a legislative bill for tax money to be paid by each state in proportion to its population. Proper constitutional funding will allow large amounts of money to fund a limited form of Republican government. To continue on the path of this massive and unconstitutional spending will bring a final and total collapse of the economy. Make no mistake about it, America. Has your government been truthful? Do you know why the withholding tax system was actually put into place? Let me provide you with just one shocking example of how things work behind the scenes. This is the text from a declassified, which was formerly a confidential committee print, on the withholding tax. This was a hearing before a subcommittee of the Committee on Finance, United States Senate, 77th Congress, second session on data relative to withholding provisions of the 1942 Revenue Act, August 21st and 22nd of 1942, printed for the use of the Committee on Finance, available through the United States Government Printing Office, Washington, 1942, Summary of Comments, Statements by Milton Friedman, Division of Tax Research, Treasury Department, Charles Hardy from the Brookings Institution, Mayor Jacob Steen of the Brookings Institution, Randolph E. Paul from the Treasury Department. Now remember, I'm reading from this government document. Overview. Because the war effort resulted in increased production and employment, which caused a sudden large influx of money into circulation, the federal government and the Federal Reserve System had to find a method of, quote, mopping up excess purchasing power, unquote, thereby control inflation and obtain immediate funds for the Treasury. Several plans were put forth before the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Committee on Finance to accomplish this purpose. The following points were made by the senators and those testifying before the committee. Number one, the overall purpose was to obtain immediate money for the war effort to control inflation and to get the income tax on a current basis instead of 1 year behind. This was supposed to be an emergency provision, ladies and gentlemen. Point number two, to accomplish this goal, it was recognized that a scheme, that's their word in this government document, it was recognized that a scheme was needed to reach the largest number of people. Number three, that the scheme, regardless of whether it was a coupon stamp or withholding of income tax at source, would constitute a forced loan to the federal government and it would apply to taxpayers and non-taxpayers alike, with exceptions. Number four, where an individual had money withheld and ultimately no tax liability, the individual would file an income tax return, and that income tax return would constitute an automatic claim for a refund. 5. The proposed plan was an emergency wartime measure. So, let me take a break here. This was page 99, or we're going to go on to page 99. First of all, this is an emergency measure for the war. Second of all, they wanted to mop up your spending power. This would be a forced loan to the government, and even if you didn't owe any taxes, they're going to take and use your money for a whole year with no interest and then give it back to you like it's some great thing. Now we'll go to page 99. Statement of Meyer Jacobstein of the Brookings Institution. Quote, "It is obvious that it is necessary to mop up the excess purchasing power of the community, not only because of its effect on the price situation, but because the Treasury needs the money and it needs it quickly. Obviously, the Treasury can collect from the consumers as the purchases are made, and the Treasury has the use of those funds long before it would obtain them by the income tax method. Now, there are many ways, of course, mopping up this surplus purchasing power. There is the withholding tax at the source based on payroll." Unquote. Senator Clark, questioning. Doctor, what this plan is, it is essentially a compulsory savings plan based on sales tax methods, is it not? Mr. Jacobstein, I should say that is a fair description of it, yes. It is the use of a sales tax method without being a tax. Senator Clark, so far as the impact on the public is concerned, it is precisely the same as a sales tax, except you give the money back sometimes. Mr. Jacobstein, that is right. That is a very fair statement, I think. Senator Danhower used the word self-assessment. If I buy a $1 necktie, I pay $1.10 under his plan. A withholding tax is usually withheld at the source. Here you would hold it not at the manufacturer's end, but at the retailer's end. You are using the retailer instead of the manufacturer to siphon off several $billion, depending on the rate of the assessment of a tax. It may be that several systems can be used. Any one of them might be very useful to the Treasury in accomplishing this purpose. But for siphoning off purchasing power into the Treasury from day to day or week to week or month to month, and it does have an advantage. Now, there is an aspect to this question which was not brought out in the original memorandum, which would make the scheme perhaps a little more palatable if certain deductions were made by any method, either by the withholding tax method or direct sales tax method or by Senator Danhower's proposal. Don't you just love what these people were doing way back then? Let us now go on to the statement of Charles Harding of the Brookings Institution. Mr. Hardy states, first, mainly for the purpose of providing an exemption from the tax or forced loan, either one of them. Now, and has been stated a moment ago, this is a forced loan. It should be pointed out, I think, that you can do the same thing with the mechanics of any other tax. That is, under the income tax, you can give out bonds or coupons, redeemable in bonds, instead of giving receipts for the income tax. You can do that, as far as I can see, with any tax for the whole schedule of taxes. Boy, I'll tell you, back in the days of our founding fathers, these people would have been run out of Washington on a rail. Mr. Hardy continues, I would like to say that we have to bring about a readjustment of consumption in the country to the amount of consumer goods and services that we can spare the resources to produce under war conditions. First, we've got to devote our productive energies to the war. Or you can use the mechanism of the sales tax, as far as I can see, by mopping up the increased purchasing power that is created by the rising amount they receive in their paychecks. On the other hand, if the money is stored up, whether it is in the form of these stamps or in the form where people haven't spent it because they have had no way to spend it, in either case, if it is too large a proportion, you are going to have the problem whenever you do turn it loose that you have now in the other case, namely of having a lot more purchasing power than you have goods and service to make it good with. That is the answer, I think, to the question that might be raised as to why not carry this principle through and apply it to the income tax, corporation tax, and everything else. Obviously, this has the advantage that this definitely sews up the purchasing power in such a way that it cannot be released until we discover the proper way to release it. I think it has a great advantage over the deficient spending program. This program just postpones the problem of administration in deciding how much purchasing power is available to release and to what extent it will create the old wartime inflation over again. Unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, the private central bank is the one that creates inflation by manipulating our money supply. In response to these comments by Mr. Hardy, Senator Danahauer says, let me ask you this question. Considering the withholding tax, simply the Treasury withholds it currently and applies the proceeds against the tax due in a given year. Mr. Hardy, the deduction from salaries and interest and so on at the source question? Senator, yes. Mr. Hardy, yes. Senator, that is a currently applied method of withholding so much of the consumer purchasing power as it is represented by the tax collected or withheld. Mr. Hardy, that is right, Senator, and the applied as against the tax due. Mr. Hardy, yes. The withholding tax provision has the effect of withholding purchasing power at the time the income is realized rather than a year hence through the income tax structure. Senator, and if it were in effect for 1 year, it would apply only 1 year? Mr. Hardy, I guess so. Senator, yeah. Whereas this proposal is a continuing thing. Mr. Hardy, it seems to me that the essential difference is that the withholding tax plan applies at the point of receipt of income, and this applies at the point of expenditures of income. Senator, of course, you withhold not only from the taxpayers, but non-taxpayers. Mr. Hardy, yes, some of the people that I talked to about this plan, Federal Reserve people, have been rather favorable to the idea. Mr. Jacobstein, don't you want to add that Mr. Selko pointed out that such difficulties are as encountered in the states, partially at least overcome when you have a uniform federal tax, where you have a uniform tax all over the country by one administration, the federal government, it is easier to administer it than a sum total of 48 states? Now that was Mr. Selko's conclusion. Remember what Vivian Kellum said about apportionment. And remember that the fraudulent ratification of the 16th Amendment wiped out that apportionment. Let's move on to the statement of Milton Friedman, Division of Tax Research, Treasury Department. Senator Danahauer, I have only one other thought on that point. In the event of withholding from the owner of stock and no taxes due ultimately, where does he get his refund? Mr. Friedman, you're thinking of a corporation or an individual? Senator, I'm talking about an individual. Friedman, an individual will file an income tax return, and that income tax return will constitute an automatic claim for refund. And that's the end of those comments. What bald-faced lies. Mop up purchasing power? Fleecing Americans dry is a more accurate way to describe this terrible injustice against we the people. How about letting Americans decide to save the fruits of their labor? No, the government wants it all. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to issue money, not the privately owned Federal Reserve banking cartel. Article 1, Section 8 says Congress shall issue money, quote, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, unquote. Cut out the middleman, the Fed, and the Treasury wouldn't need the money. What a con game going on against the American people. T. Coleman Andrews, who was a Democrat, was commissioner for the first 33 months of the Eisenhower administration. He was the commissioner of the IRS, and he stated the following in an article for U.S. News and Report, May 25, 1956. Remember, the commissioner of the IRS, quote, "We're confiscating property now. That's socialism. It's written into the Communist Manifesto. Maybe we ought to see that every person who gets a tax return receives a copy of the Communist Manifesto with it so he can see what's happening to him," unquote. Beardsley Ruml, chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, stated in one of his speeches in 1946, quote, "The second principal purpose of federal taxes is to attain more equality of wealth and of income than would result from economic forces working alone. The taxes which are effective for this purpose are the progressive individual income tax, the progressive estate tax, and the gift tax. What these taxes should be depends on public policy with respect to the distribution of wealth and of income. It is important here to note that the estate and gift taxes have little or no significance as tax measures for stabilizing the value of the dollar. Their purpose is the social purpose of preventing what otherwise would be high concentration of wealth and income at a few points as a result of investment and reinvestment of income not expended in meeting day-to-day consumption requirements. These taxes should be defended and attacked in terms of their effects on the character of the American people, not as revenue measures. Taxes on corporation profits have three principal consequences, all of them bad," unquote. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, those estate and inheritance taxes, the person that has given it to you or willed it to you, they've already paid taxes through the nose unconstitutionally all their lives. And now, when your loved one is buried and in the ground, the vultures, the scavengers come in from the government to continue picking their bones and tax and tax and tax. Does the average man or woman in America know all this information? What do we mean when we say that the IRS is not part of an agency of the government? What? What do you mean when we say the IRS is an agency of the government? Of course it is. Well, let me read you from a document from a U.S. attorney submitted in court documents in a tax case up in Idaho. Quote from the document, Betty Richardson, United States Attorney, Box 32, Boise, Idaho, civil case number 93-405-E-EJL, United States Answer and Claim Re, Diversified Metal Products, Inc., Plaintiff versus T-Bone, Internal Revenue Service. We're going to go to page 4, paragraph 4 of this government document in court. Quote, "The U.S. government denies that the Internal Revenue Service is an agency of the United States government. If the IRS is not an agency of the federal government, just what is it?" I know, but we don't have time to go into all of this minutia on the CD at this time. In a nutshell, the income tax is international in scope and is not incumbent upon domestic Americans. That is a provable fact, and that is why this U.S. attorney denies the U.S. government that the Internal Revenue Service is an agency of the United States government. The IRS for more than 80 years has been misapplying the Internal Revenue Code against unsuspecting Americans and back up their unlawful activities with brute force. This must stop. What can you do? The federal government must generate revenues to operate what our founding fathers created, a limited form of Republican government. State constitutions are all guaranteed a limited form of Republican government. America is not a democracy. We believe America is a nation of laws and not lies. We can't have it both ways for political expediency or to please any and every special interest group that bribes politicians at all levels with the politically correct PAC money. Sometimes it's difficult to be the messenger of news that people would rather not hear. However, Americans can no longer remain in their comfort zones because the message isn't what they want to hear. If your house is on fire, you don't sit around and continue to watch the TV set. You call the fire department. America, our house is on fire, and it is the obligation of every American to safeguard the liberties and freedoms given to us by those who paid the ultimate price. Please join the growing numbers of millions of Americans who are ready to take back our country and stop the assault on our rights.